again. Welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. Hi. So in this video, we're just gonna start to touch on kind of what we've been getting at a little bit. We talked a little bit about the physiology, but now we're gonna start to actually think about how does the brain do what it does? Because that's what we're here for, right? That's what we're all about, is the physiology of how the brain actually functions. Just making sure I have my stuff where I need it. Okay. So we talked about the blood-brain barrier. We talked about how we protect the brain. Now let's talk about what's actually happening in the brain. So if we were to take the brain and we were to cut the front away from the back, so along a frontal plane, and look at it like as if you're looking at someone's face, this is kind of the image that we have here. And there are a couple of important things to point out here. All along kind of the exterior of the brain, I'm highlighting it here in blue, this is all gray matter. The gray matter of the brain. Oops, I should do the inside like I did before. So everything that I'm sort of outlining in blue, that's the darker color on your screen, this is gray matter in the brain. Okay. There are also the gray matter isn't only on the outermost portion of the brain. There are also some important structures that we're going to come back to in a little bit more detail, embedded sort of in the brain, that are also gray matter. And so those sit here, sort of in the center part of the brain, and then there are like these here. So gray matter doesn't only exist on the external surface of the brain. There are also some very, very important centers of gray matter kind of in the center of the brain. So remember, we're looking at the brain as if we've cut the front from the back. This stuff that I've sort of highlighted in blue is the gray matter. So gray matter is where the cell bodies exist. So the cell bodies of neurons, right? Remember, I hope that this is so ridiculously familiar and you're like, I do not need you to draw me another terrible neuron drawing, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. Okay, so remember, this is the cell body, right? So the gray matter contains the cell bodies of the neurons in the brain. So if the gray matter contains the cell bodies of the neurons of the brain, what do you think the white matter contains? The white matter contains the axons. Okay, so if gray matter contains the cell body, white matter contains the axons, where does synaptic transmission happen? Where is synaptic transmission? Okay. Synaptic transmission is going to have to happen in the gray matter, right? Because you've got to get an axon terminus coming and talking to a cell body, to the dendrites of a cell body, and that's going to happen in the gray matter. So then what's happening in the white matter? So the white matter is kind of like the highway, okay? The white matter is kind of like the highway of the brain. So I love this image. I think it's stunningly beautiful. Why is it not doing? There we go. Showing you out here where the majority of the gray matter is, out here, you can see how the neurons are kind of ending. Okay, that's because of what's there, the cell body, right? So the cell body is there, and the cell body is receiving information. Okay. So the cell body receives that information, and then if we take and we follow one of these, like here's our cell body. Why is it not working? So imagine here's our cell body, right? And we follow it. So this, everything that I'm drawing now is an axon, right? And then it's going to go. And so the cell body is the dot, then the axon is the green as I traveled through the white matter of the brain. And I don't know if this is actually where this goes. I'm just showing you so that you can kind of see an example. And so then what's at the other end here? That would be the axon terminus, right? So this cell body is over here in the gray matter of the brain. The axon highway travels through the brain, through the white matter, carrying that action potential, gets to another part of the brain, and that axon terminus then communicates with another cell body. So now let's imagine we have another cell body right here. Okay, so that axon traveling through the brain, it's carrying an action potential. When that action potential reaches the axon terminus at the other part of the brain, what happens? Let's stop and think for a second. What happens? What happens there at this other part of the brain? Right here, where we have, I drew the green, and I hope you can see those colors. If you can't, I sincerely apologize, and let me know, and I will try to, let me know what colors you can see, and I will try to make sure and use those. Okay, so we have that neuron, cell body in the gray matter, axon travels through the white matter to another part of the brain. That axon terminus is then there near that other cell that it needs to quote unquote talk to. So what happens at that synapse? What happens at that synapse is you're going to get the release of a neurotransmitter, right? A neurotransmitter is going to be released, and it's going to then synapse. We're going to have synaptic transmission with the cell body and dendrites of another neuron. So the cell body and dendrites of another neuron then, here I've drawn it as if it were a red neuron, cell body and dendrites are then going to receive that signal. Okay, so now let's think about if the green neuron that I first drew, what if it releases the neurotransmitter GABA? Okay, what if the green neuron releases GABA? Then what happens to that neuron that it's synapsing with? Okay, what is the synaptic transmission if the green neuron, when its action potential travels to its terminus, releases GABA? If it releases GABA, remember GABA is inhibitory. Okay, GABA is inhibitory. So if that neuron releases GABA and the synaptic transmission is inhibitory, then that green or that red neuron is going to be less likely to fire an action potential. Okay, it's going to be less likely to reach threshold at its axon hillock, and so very unlikely that it's going to produce an action potential. Okay, so what if instead of GABA, the red neuron released glutamate? Okay, glutamate is a stimulatory or an excitatory neurotransmitter. releases glutamate. That's an excitatory neurotransmitter. That's going to depolarize the cell. It's going to make it more positive, okay? Make the cell more positive. And so then this neuron that I've made red is then more likely, and I don't know where it would go, just making this up, to produce an action potential because it's more likely to release or to reach threshold at the axon hillock and produce an action potential. And then wherever its axon goes through the white matter, it carries that message, it carries that electrical impulse through the brain to whatever other part of the brain that it talks to. Okay, so the gray matter is where the synapses occur. This is where synaptic transmission occurs. This is where the cell bodies are. And then the white matter is kind of like the highways. Okay, so it's where the information travels from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. Okay, and also keep in mind, as I showed you here, not all of the gray matter is on the exterior of the brain. We also have some very important gray matter deep in the brain, in the center of the brain. Okay, so what do these central gray matter things do? What is their job? Let's talk about that for a minute. Okay, so these gray matter areas, so places where we have groups of cell bodies rather than just axons, is gray matter, right? And so these are deep in the brain, okay? And these are the basal ganglia. Okay, these groupings of cell bodies, this gray matter, deep in the brain, are the basal ganglia. And so in the peripheral nervous system, when we have a grouping of cell bodies together, we call those nuclei. In the brain, when we have a grouping of cell bodies, we call them ganglia. So I'm going to put nuclei here just to help you sort of like link those things, okay? So these are our basal ganglia. And they do some really important things. I don't have space. Trying to figure out the best way to do this, and you know, everything has positives and negatives. Okay, so what do the basal ganglia do? So the basal ganglia control movement. They control movement. Now, the basal ganglia control movement. What coordinates that movement? Stop and think for a second. There's another part of the brain that coordinates movement. What's that part of the brain that coordinates movement? What coordinates it? Okay. Cerebellum coordinates movement. Okay, so these control movement, and they're integration centers. So they integrate all sorts of information passing through the brain. These are really important integration centers, okay? So gray matter, cell bodies, this is where synapsis occurs. White matter is where the axons are passing through, so that the white matter is kind of like the highways, okay? It's where information goes from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. And that's just a beautiful image that I think is really cool. Okay, so the brain as a whole is separated into two hemispheres. And we can see this very easily visually. It's actually physically separated into two hemispheres. Each of the hemispheres kind of does different things a little bit. So you could kind of think of it as like specialization, and we're going to dig into that a little bit more in our next set of lectures. Okay, but we have two hemispheres. These two hemispheres have to talk to each other, okay? They need to communicate with each other. And this sort of groove actually goes quite deep. If you look here, you can see that the brain is actually physically, each hemisphere, is actually quite physically separated from the other hemisphere, okay? We have quite a lot of actual physical separation. There's just with this one small area where the two hemispheres connect. Okay, and that small area where the two hemispheres connect, we've seen it before, is the corpus callosum. Okay, so the corpus callosum connects left and right hemispheres. And I'm going to show you a video because it's really cool. Where is that? Because we tend to sort of see things one-dimensionally when we're trying to simplify them, which is fine. But I just want to show you that you've seen the corpus callosum before, and depending on like if we're sectioning the brain, sometimes we, when we simplify, we make it seem like something's a bit different than it is. And so from previous lectures, when I talked just about the overall basic structure of the brain, I showed you the corpus callosum before. And so the corpus callosum is this whole area in the brain that's right in the center between those two hemispheres. And as it passes by, you can kind of see where that separation comes, right there. Boom, separation. Now right here, watch it again. The separation, okay? And so then the corpus callosum is this red little section here. And it's where the two hemispheres of the brain talk to each other. It's how they communicate with each other. So next question to think about is, if the corpus callosum is this section of the brain where the two hemispheres communicate with each other, what is the corpus callosum composed of? What's it made of? So think about what communicates with what. Okay. So the corpus callosum is made of white matter. White matter, it's made of white matter, and white matter's what? Axons. Okay, so this is the highway between the two sides of the brain. So this has to be white matter because we need to be able to get information from one side to the other. So it's white matter. White matter is made up of axons. So the corpus callosum is where the cell bodies of the left hemisphere talk to the cell bodies of the right hemisphere. So this is sort of the highway between the two sides of the brain. Okay. Just a little note, hearkening back to previous lectures, we were talking about the brain. We already talked about the spinal cord. That is a terrible drawing. Blech, that's so bad. Hang on, I'll fix it. Don't worry. Okay, so remember our spinal cord, this is an important connection to make so you don't get confused later. Remember that our spinal cord, in the center is the gray matter, right? Middle is the gray matter. And then on the outside is the white matter. So now let's take this information that we just learned about what's where. So in the brain, the cell bodies are in the gray matter. So the synaptic transmission happens in the gray matter. And the white matter is the axons. So it's the nerve tracks. It's where the information passes. And so now let's take that information and let's pair it with what we learned previously about the spinal cord, right? So the gray matter is in the center, the white matter is on the outside. So where are the parts of the spinal cord where the brain communicates with the spinal cord? So the central nervous system communicates with itself. Where are those? So I'm going to think about that for a second. Okay, the central nervous system communicates with itself in the white matter, right? So remember, we had our ascending tracks and our descending tracks of white matter. So how the central nervous system talks to itself, I apologize, I don't remember exactly which colors I used. That's in the white matter. So what does that mean? What are those ascending tracks and descending tracks composed of? What are they made of? ascending tracts and the descending tracts made of? Ascending tracts and descending tracts have to be made of axons, right? The axons are what's carrying the information up to the brain or down from the brain into the spinal cord, or from this level of the spinal cord down lower into other levels of the spinal cord. So the white matter, same thing in the spinal cord, is also axons. Okay, so the white matter is axons. It's those nerve tracts. Okay, gray matter, we already said this, we already talked about this, but now we're going to really bring it home, relating it to the brain. The gray matter, remember that we can have information coming in if we're talking about sensory, right? We have information coming in if we're talking about the dorsal root, or we can have information going out if we're talking about the ventral root. Another color. Let's use another color. Okay? But whether we have information coming in or going out, or we're talking about the dorsal root or we're talking about the ventral root, what's happening, I mean horn. Sorry, we haven't talked about the roots yet. Dorsal horn and ventral horn, we'll talk about the roots. So dorsal horn, ventral horn, regardless if information is coming in to the gray matter or information is leaving the gray matter, what is happening in those horns? What's happening? Synapsis is happening, right? One neuron is talking to another neuron, and the way that they talk to each other is through neurotransmitters. So you've got a cell body talking to, or an axon terminus talking to a cell body. So once again, same exact thing as in, I don't know if you can see that. Same thing as in the brain. We have our cell bodies in the gray matter. And the important thing to just sort of grab onto and hold onto here is that the cell bodies are where synaptic transmission happens, right? You can't get a graded potential, which triggers an action potential, unless you're talking to a cell body. Cool. Or a dendrite extending off of a cell body. Okay. So in the central nervous system, we've got our cell bodies and our dendrites right there, talking to whatever other axon via neurotransmitters that we're interested in. When we get into the peripheral nervous system, things get a little bit wonky. Okay, so when we come back next time, we're going to talk a little bit more about specific functions of the brain.